Hello, I am Dr. Sonia Doi, President of the International Spiritist Medical Association, and I welcome you all who are with us today in this first virtual Congress for the International Spiritist Medical Association. Today I am honored and privileged to be able to introduce to you a great friend of ours, Dr. Decio Iandoli Jr., who is known by many of you and needs no introduction. But really summarizing his curriculum, I can say that Dr. Iandoli is a surgeon of the intestinal tract, has a doctorate in medicine by the Federal University of the State of São Paulo in Brazil, and is a professor at the University of Medicine in Mato Grosso do Sul. He's also a president of the Spiritist Medical Association of Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil. It's a coordinator as well in Brazil, and is a vice president of our International Spiritist Medical Association. Our dear colleague is known internationally by his relentless efforts to share Spiritism and continues to expand on the work of our wonderful Dr. Marlene Nobri. And he has just finished publishing a book called Dr. Marlene Nobri and the Medical Ideal, and we hope that soon enough it can be translated into English so that most people can enjoy this great work. So without further ado, Dr. Decio is going to talk to us today about the actions of thought in immune responses. And with you, here's Dr. Iandoli. Thank you, Dr. Sonia, for the kind words. And I am thankful for the opportunity of work with Dr. Sonia at the International Spiritist Medical Association. We have been trying to take these ideas, which are ideas that have a philosophical basis within Spiritism, and which are put forth with a scientific context, which is our major goal, and promote the union between science and spirituality. And the topic given to me for this talk is extremely important and quite well researched. I want to thank Dr. Vicente Pessoa, who is an infectologist and helped me a lot in the search of articles, and Dr. Marco Aurelio Bastos Jr., who also speak at this Congress, and his master's and doctorate thesis is on physiology of mediumship, who also helped me a lot with a literature search to bring some more solid data on this topic. This talk focuses on the action of thoughts on the immune response, from Spiritist revelation to scientific knowledge. And I'll allow myself to make a change. Instead of starting with the Spiritist revelation, I'll start with scientific knowledge. This will help in understanding, when I start talking about the Spiritist revelation, that there is a very important connection and very clear ideas and thoughts in the Spiritist work, especially in the Spiritist revelation from the books of Francisco Cândido Xavier and Spirit André Luiz, which is our basic reference. I had the opportunity, together with Dr. George Dye and Dr. Giancarlo Lucchetti, to publish an article talking about the information that was anticipated by André Luiz brought about the pineal gland. We published it in the journal Neuroendocrinology, and this work represented a step towards science, showing how the Spiritist revelation brought by the medium Chico Xavier contains extremely useful and somewhat prophetic information, including a series of data concerning mediumship, neuroendocrinology, spirituality, and so on. Now, let's start by talking a little bit about the scientific aspects. So I'll address the issues related to scientific knowledge. We're living a very interesting moment in science. New horizons are opening up, especially in relation to spirituality. While this seems like something new, we realize that this publication is from 1910 by Sir William Osler, who at that time spoke about faith and health. This document we believe to be very important. It was published in 2014 in Explorer, and it's a manifesto of a post-materialist science, signed by authors like Dr. Mario Beauregard, Gary Schwartz, Larry Dozy, Alexandra Moreira Almeida, Lisa Miller, Marilyn Schitz, Dr. Tart Charles, and Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who will also speak in this Congress. And in this manifest, they articulate why science should have no prejudices when talking about spirituality. Many scientists still think that the issue of spirituality is not something that should be dealt with by scientists. But we believe that science seeks truth, whatever truth is. So these authors made this manifest, and more than 300 scientists have already signed the post-materialist manifest. And here's the reference of Open Sciences, where you can see the list of scientists who signed the manifest. So I think this is a very important milestone reached by science. Why? Because here, scientists themselves are saying that there's not only matter, they are stating that there is something beyond matter that must be studied by science with the same seriousness, with the same criteria, with the same rigor that has always been characteristic of the scientific method. And we're now here bringing a little bit of this post-materialistic science. This journal of Religion and Health, published since 1962, and we realize that it's not so new, and it has already been a scientific journal publishing about spirituality, psychology, the issues of moods, the psyche, and the impacts on the biological body, on the physical body. And I consider Dr. Harold Canning one of the most important authors on this subject. Dr. Canning is from Duke University in the United States. He has been a few times in Brazil, invited by Dr. Marlene. And this book, Spirituality in Patient Care, was published in Portuguese by the Folha Espírita, and the newest edition was published by AMI, the Brazil publisher. And Dr. Canning was able to establish an extremely solid empirical foundation on the impact of spirituality on health and for spirituality as a health-promoting factor. And he has motivated a good number of doctors and of scientists to consider the subject in a different way. It's no longer a perspective that religion deals with and science deals with matter. Science seeks truth, whatever it is. And at this time, when we know so deeply about matter, when scientists have identified subatomic particles and they study extremely relevant aspects of quantum mechanics, the dynamics of the universe, and also the subatomic aspects of physics, the physics of particles, what does all of this mean to medicine? How is this going to be related to biological health and mental health as well? Why not? If we're made of atoms, of molecules, of our body is composed of atoms and molecules, how can we ignore that particle physics will have information that is relevant to medicine, physiology, cytology, biology, and so on? So we're living in this moment. Now, we'll bring some elements, some articles that talk about the subject of spirituality related to health in general. In mental health, spirituality in psychotic disorders, spirituality in physical health, in palliative care, the relation of spirituality with grief and death. Spirituality is extremely relevant, extremely important. Now we see palliative care coming as a medical specialty. We realize how important it is to consider spirituality, and the doctors who work in palliative care already know it. Spirituality is already an integral part of this specialty. So we have seen a series of lines of research emerging that are studying the impacts of spirituality and that distinguish between spirituality and religion, which is a fundamental issue. I have the opportunity here at the university where I teach to give an introduction on spirituality to students, and the first thing we do is to distinguish religion from religiosity and from spirituality. And this is very important. Of course, religion is also a part of the social context, the mental context, the spiritual context of the patient, but it is not spirituality itself. We have highlighted that even patients who do not have a religion may have spirituality, and a spirituality that may be well developed, may be in balance or not. And this has an impact on the biological health and mental health of patients. Our talk today is in focus on immunity. So we bring some aspects related to that. This article is extremely important and study grieving parents versus people who were not mourning. They study these subjects 2 weeks after the events of the death of their child or children, and then 6 months later, so in the acute phase and in the chronic phase. And they study the immunological pattern, the pro-inflammatory patterns, and the thrombotic patterns of these patients, which all worsened up to 6 months after the event. The closer the event of death, the more severe the pro-inflammatory and thrombotic pattern of these subjects. This shows how the emotional state and obviously the thoughts being emitted from the emotional state have an impact on the immune system. This other work, published in Behavioral Medicine, studied 260 patients who lost close relatives and compared with 269 who had not endured grieving within 5 to 63 months. The age of their patients ranged from 34 to 84 years, and they found that the interleukin-6, which is primarily a pro-inflammatory factor, an initiator of inflammation, and SE-selectin, which is also a pro-inflammatory factor, had an increase that was higher as closer to the loss of the relatives. So this emotional impact, the greater the emotional impact, and in this case we're talking about emotions that we consider negative, adverse emotions, significantly increase interleukin-6 and SE-selectin, demonstrating how they influence the immune system. This is another very important work which studied children who were mistreated, who suffered physical or mental or psychological abuse. And they studied 29 children compared to 7 children in a control group and showed that there is an increase in absolute values of CD4 lymphocytes and cytotoxic CD8 helper. And what does that mean? It means that children who have been abused, who have been assaulted, who have undergone processes of negative stress emotions have hyperactive immune systems with an increased chance of developing immunological diseases, especially rheumatic diseases, because they develop an overactive cellular immunity. So, while we observe an increased inflammatory effect in adult subjects who have had losses, we also realize that in children there is an impact that is often retained even through adolescence and through adulthood, and that the memory of aggression and abuse is a factor that creates an imbalance in their immune system. And here is another work that analyzes religiosity or the attending religious services, actually looking at attending religious services given only an overall evaluation of spirituality. Allport's work shows how religiosity can be intrinsic or extrinsic. That is, extrinsic religiosity is that in which an individual attends a religious service, but this is done for social purposes, with more social interaction, interest, and a philosophical interest, or in changing his way of seeing the world, his behavior toward pain, toward death, and so on. So, Allport refers to extrinsic religiosity when people attend a religious service, but there's no impact of religious philosophy on their lives. And the intrinsic religiosity, when there is an impact on attending religious services, when they do have a philosophical impact and an impact on their lives. In any case, still valid today, although not in an absolute form, the evaluation of the degree of spirituality in individuals by the frequency of their attendance of religious services. And this publication shows that interleukin-6, the cytokine that we have already referred to as pro-inflammatory factor, which triggers the inflammatory process. So, individuals who never, or almost never, attended religious services had higher interleukin-6 values than those individuals who attend more frequently. And the study also noted that the frequency is inversely proportional to the level of interleukin, showing that there is indeed an action, an interference from religious practices on the inflammatory effect of by interleukin. So, addressing the issue more directly, we should seek for an interpretation of how this happens. As we're doing a review on the subject, we realize the following. There's not much doubt in the scientific arena that the emotional state of patients indirectly influences their immune system. What does not yet exist are explanations of how this happens, why it happens, what is the physiology underlying this process. And here we bring this publication from the American Psychological Association, which is a relatively recent work from 2015 that reports the positive effect of emotions, mildly positive on markers on inflammation. That is, The individual does not need to have a very significant event, but the individual who is more optimistic, who has a more positive emotional attitude, has a lower level of inflammatory cytokines, especially interleukin-6, which is a reference. And the authors of this article are from the University of Toronto, the University of Pittsburgh and Berkeley in the United States. So as we see, these are important universities, serious researchers who are working in this post-materialistic medicine and are studying the correlation between emotional states and immune responses. And this is another article that addresses how positive emotions and mental health can play a positive effect on immunology. And the authors raised the hypothesis of a decrease in vagal tone, that is, a reduction in stress states that can originate a positive effect at a medium and long term on the immune system. And we bring here from the University of North Carolina, University of California, Duke University, that is the home of Dr. Harold Koenig. And this is chapter of the Psychoneuroimmunology book of 2007, in which the authors talk about the positive effects on immune function and effects of positive emotions on immune function. That means positive sentiments act on immune function. In this chapter, what caught my attention was this table where they list several articles that were published on this issue that talk about mood or mood states and the immune system, and this other table also lists studies that relate mood and immune function. So we can see by the number of articles and studies that is no longer a controversial issue, really. The controversy is related to the mechanisms, which way we have to go to clarify in a more relevant the aspects of immune system control and the effect of sentiments and thoughts. This is an extremely significant work by Dr. Vicente, brought up that shows that in patients who had meningococcal disease, the rates of patients protected by vaccine was similar to the rates of those who attended religious services. And this is extremely significant. One has to look for biases, which studies were conducted in a more serious way, the methodology that was used. This is an extremely well-conducted study published by a reputable journal, the British Journal of Medicine, that brings an extremely revealing conclusion that the vaccine can have an effect similar to a spiritual state, a positive and balanced mental state. And they discuss the factors that may have influenced this outcome. For example, social support, the habits of people attending religious services, which tend to be healthier, life happens healthier, and so on. And this other article shows that those individuals who were diagnosed with HIV and who began to attend religious services, these individuals had a better response to treatment. With the use of a cocktail treatment, they responded with a decrease in viral load and increased in the level of CD4, which was significantly higher response than those individuals who did not attend religious services. So we began to realize that a relationship between emotional states and immunity has already been identified, and that it can go both ways: an improvement of immunity or the exacerbation of immunity leading to immunological diseases, rheumatic diseases, and immune suppressor leading to greater chance of neoplastic disease and infections. But science is still beginning to study the mechanisms underlying these effects. And we will now bring some information of the Spiritist revelation based on the work of Chico Xavier and André Luiz. We'll begin by talking about thought. In the scientific discussion, we did not even address this aspect because the very concept of mind, consciousness, has no consensus within science yet. We still have several discussions ongoing on the subject. The terms that are used, the term mind or consciousness, the term thought, they're used differently by different schools of thought, by different areas of science. So I chose to discuss the question of thought as brought by Spiritism. We have here these two statements that come from the book Our Home, or Nosso Lar, which is the first book in the Chico Xavier André Luiz series, in which Veneranda, higher order spirit, talks about thought, and she brings information that is very interesting. Her first statement is that thought is the basis of spiritual relations among beings. That is, it's not only the spoken words, it's not only the presence, it's not only the mechanical action of one on the other, but it's the thought that connects us. This is also something that has been studied for a long time. Parapsychology has already studied this issue, and we're very close to begin studying this aspect also, and the impact of human health and even on animal health. So she states that thought is the basis of the spiritual relationships of beings among themselves, but that we should not forget there were millions of souls in the universe, and that we're souls still not totally compliant with universal laws. That means we are grains of sand, millions of souls in the universe, and still ignorant souls, souls who do not know all laws, all truths, so to say. And that is why I've said, and I say it again, that I believe that science is our vehicle to truth. And that a well-conducted science, a well-done science, in a bias-free form, will reveal the truth, even if it takes a while. Then she states that thought itself is the basis of all silent messages of the mind. So that's what I said earlier regarding science. It's the mood that is measured. People who are sad, people who are bereaved, people in depression. So the idea that it is the product of the soul generates thought. So thought is the vehicle of sentiment, and it's the vehicle of the idea. Then she explains the relationship between thought, idea, and intuition. I have seen even some materialistic scientists who are skeptical using the word intuition and not even suspecting that intuition by itself, it's already a spiritual effect. It's already a spiritual interference on their own thinking. Still in André Louis' work, Evolution in Two Worlds, we'll see that André Louis talks about the particle of thought. And there comes an aspect that is quite interesting. Thinking as a wave, as an electromagnetic wave. Of course, it's not an electromagnetic wave the way we know it, but it works within a different dimension because it's traveling in the ether at a different speed from other electromagnetic waves that we know as radio waves, for example. But he states that there's a particle of thought, and that thought is a fluidic material. Right? Fluid is a matter of low density. It's malleable. It's fluidic matter, or as Allan Kardec said, and many physicists use that word, it is a quintessential matter. That's a much more subtle matter, much more ethereal. And he thinks that the particle of thought, as much as the atom, is a unit, in essence, that can subdivide into several types according to the quality, quantity, behavior, and trajectory of the components that integrate it. So, as far as the atom is, the thought particle would be used to produce different manifestations. And in the case of the atom, matter in the case of particles of thought, which are ethereal particles, the formation of thought according to the type of thought. And the type of thought will vary according to the type of idea or sentiment that produced it. And then he explained later in another passage that the atom is a living and powerful force itself in its context, however, which is passive to the intelligence that mobilizes us for good or evil. The particle of thought, although alive and powerful in its composition as produced by the spirit, is also equally passive to the sentiment that gives it the form and nature for good or for evil. This means that both the atom and the particle of thought are tools. They are instruments that can be used for the manifestation, in the case of the atom, and the form of the particle, a thought for the idea. So how then does the thought interact with the physical body? Well, the first thing we need to draw attention to is that André Louis informs us that cells, they're like tiny animals that are domesticated and orderly arranged in the organic hive. That is, the cells that form our body are quite rudimentary forms of life, and that are at the service of a more advanced form of life. That is our soul, our individuality, or our individualized intelligent principle, however we want to call it. We can call it soul or we can call it spirit. But anyway, when we incarnate, we create an informational field where these tiny animals are arranged, organized according to information, according to the nature of the individuals who's more complex, who is controlling them. So they are domesticated rudimentary forms of life that obey thought, be it a simple thought or a complex thought that commands their existence. So this applies to us humans, but it also applies to the animals that are before us on the evolutionary scale, in the phylogenetic scale of the planet. So all animals that have cell diversity or self-differentiation are multicellular animals and are already a more complex form of intelligence, and that control these more primitive forms that are the cells. So André Lewis informs that multiple forms will adapt to the functions specifically attributed to them. And this is also quite important when referring to embryology, because there is a very plausible explanation for how cells will differentiate and how they will find their specific three-dimensional position to become a nerve cell, a muscle cell, a fatty cell, although they all have in their nucleus the same genetic information. So what would make a cell rise to the most cranial part of the animal to become a nerve cell, and what makes another cell go down to become a muscle cell? Why does the cell differentiation occur? Where is the command for the cell to acquire differentiation and position itself? Then he tells us that there are multiple forms adapting themselves to the function that they were designated into the vehicle of manifestation of the organism that temporarily contains them. This is talking about the issues of cycles, incarnate, discarnate, and discarnate and incarnate, as intelligent electromagnetic pieces that would be the cells in a super intelligent electromagnetic machine. So these rudimentary forms of life are cells serving the most intelligent forms of life that are pluricellular animals, the most complex animals, as a mammal or as ourselves, humans, and attending with mathematical precision the commands of the mind. And because they are rudimentary, they have no will of their own. They have a cellular automatism that we know very well through cytology and biology, and we know how to influence the function of these cells, acting on their nucleus, determining the proteins that are synthesized or not, the genes that are expressed or not. He still goes on to explain that thought or mental fluid flows. So he compares thought with fluid, once again bringing information that thought is a material form. That means thought would be a superluminal electromagnetic wave that brings its content programmed within itself, information of the idea or sentiment, and that it would be a subtle secretion not of the brain but of the mind. Then the mind produces thought through its ideas and sentiments. This thought first influenced the cortical region of the brain and then impacts the cells. So now we return to the question of immunology. Then thoughts flow from the mind impacts the brain, and the brain impacts other cells, thereby health or disease. This leads us to think about the phenomenon of the placebo effect and the nocebo effect. And he goes even one step further and talks about the organization of the psychosphere or psychic halo. There'll be kind of a mental atmosphere that we generate with our thinking. Since this thought is an electromagnetic wave, it's material, even though it's a quintessential etheric matter, it would be impregnated in our brain, inducing our brain to a repetitive thought, as if it were looping. So when we generate a deleterious thought, and we use this deleterious thought with some frequency, we end up generating this thought form that gets stuck in our psychosphere. Andoli is even called as mental worms or mental larvae, which would be forms created by our own unsettled thinking, and that ends up functioning as a form of looping, repeating or producing a re-entry of these thoughts in our consciousness. And that would be extremely deleterious, damaging to our health. He also speaks about the relationship of thought with the physical body, and that these mental fluids are thoughts that are active in the realm of the soul. They imprint radicals, transformations in the physio-psychomatic vehicle. So, from the readings of Andrelli's work, I came to the conclusion that when he talks of biopsychosomatic vehicle, he's talking about the biological body and the etheric double. He's talking about the biological physical part, which we can study and demonstrate quite well with classical medicine, orthodox medicine. But he's also talking about an energetic field of something that is also working in there and that has an influence on the soul, the mind, as well as on the biological body. And finally, he directly addresses the issue of thought and immunity, and he explains that it's easy to understand that all the unruly physical or moral is reflected immediately by consequent mental reactions on the cellular domains, determining favorable or unfavorable situations to the organic balance, equilibrium. So, the unruly, both physical and moral, will reflect on these cells in a positive fashion or in negative fashion. And thought, as the force that properly oriented to ensure the level of cellular entities in the physiological realm, listen to what he says, facilitates the migration or accelerates mobility to certain preservation of defense effects. So he's here clearly talking about the cells of the cellular immunity, the macrophages, the cells that are going to do the first fight or identification of antigens, whether improvising the battling and immunological elements or in challenging pathogenic processes with the intervention of consciousness. So there's so much information that has been brought more than 70 years ago and written by someone who had no higher education, who had no access to scientific knowledge, and even if he had at the time, these concepts and ideas were not developed. So much so that they have passed unsuspected until today. And it is time, in our opinion, to bring out this information, this data, because they affirm in much detail, what we are only beginning to find through scientific research. And here he says something that I find extremely significant. We deduce with no difficulty that it's possible to hypnotize the human mind for certain purposes. The magnetization of corpuscular entities is certainly possible when aiming specific adjustments of cells. This means that if it is possible to magnetize a complex mind like that of human beings, why would it not be possible to hypnotize these tiny domesticated cellular animals? In my opinion, they are already hypnotized and follow blindly and automatically the stimuli that come from our thoughts, from a deep consciousness. And then I put in parentheses that this would explain the placebo effect and the nocebo effect. Some scientific articles on placebo effects show that individuals begin to produce substances that they did not produce before. They begin to produce neurotransmitters that they did not produce before, simply because they believe that they received a medication that causes them to produce these substances. And when they're told that they did not receive any medication, then they stop producing the hormone or the substance that they were producing. That is, what commands our cells are not drugs or medications. Drugs and medications are inducers. Who commands the cells and determines how they will work is our deep consciousness. And why do I say deep consciousness? Because it goes far beyond our obvious consciousness. We have an effect on cells that is much more connected to what is happening within us than what is manifested by us. So when we're hiding our emotional state, even from ourselves, we can't hide it from the cells as they're connected to our soul. This is in the book Mechanisms of Mediumship, which is quite interesting. He adds in this book on page 155 that from the results the imposition of vigilance on our own direction, since only straight conduct or correct behavior supports the straight thought. With this correct thought, prayer, whatever degree of intellectual knowledge, is the highest touch of induction that immediately places ourselves in a regimen of communion with the higher spheres. So here he makes it very clear that regardless of the religion, even if there is an intrinsic religiosity, as I referred earlier and spoke about the concept from Alport, if there is a prayer, not a mechanical prayer of reciting words or praying loud to try to impress people around you, but we are talking about the prayer that comes from the soul, from our thoughts, from our deepest, most sincere feelings, when we seek the connection with something greater, the connection with superior spirituality, with goodness, when we think of charity, when we act in charity. So that brings the straight, correct thinking that opens our connection with the higher spheres and will lead our immunity to health. And if it's elevated, if it's exacerbated, there is modulation. If it's depressed, it gives support or contributes to so that the immunity returns to its state, to its ideal tone, to its state of balance. So the immunity has to be always balanced. If it's increased or decreased, it will become harmful to human health. And then in the book Evolution into Worlds, he states that the support to others creates support to ourselves. So this links back to what I've said previously about charity, which is why the principles of Jesus are liberating us from animality and pride, vanity and greed, from cruelty and avarice, and exhorting us to simplicity, humility, boundless brotherhood, and unconditional forgiveness, establishes, when followed, that there is a perfect state of immunology in our lives. This means that if we leave aside our deviations from good and goodness, pride, vanity, greed, our baser tendencies, and if we stimulate in our lives simplicity, humility, fraternity, we'll find perfect immunology, strengthening our power of mind in the self-defense against all the destructive and degrading elements that surround us, being they pathogens or microorganisms, being physical effects of nature taken from the environment. All these aggressions will be less harmful, less virulent, as we develop these aspects that connect us to the highest, to God. And this is a law, a natural law. And it is because of this natural law that we're led in one way or another to evolve. To the evolution, not only biological, of the physical body, but above all, the evolution of our minds, of our souls, of our spirits. In the Spiritist Medical Association of Brazil and the International Spiritist Medical Association, we have written articles always making this connection between science and spirituality. We have published some books some of them already being translated into English in an attempt to expand this idea so that they can be available to our colleagues in the United States, England, or the whole world, since English is one of the best known languages. So our aim is to make these ideas available to be evaluated by others, and we are doing our best to get there. So I hope this talk has been helpful, that these ideas may be productive, and that they may have at least an inspired approach, inspired our colleagues to study the subject further, delving into the effect of the soul over the physical body. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, good friend, Dr. Decio Iandoli, for this talk full of insights. It certainly reminds us of the importance, especially during this era and this difficult times where our entire planet is going through a pandemic, the importance of us maintaining our immune system strengthened. And in that way, these awarenesses, this knowledge that you've brought us about spirituality with scientific basis, and even more with the Spiritist explanations, they really help strengthen ourselves, and I hope that they can all be very helpful and useful to everyone who's following us. It's also a great encouragement for all of us who are professionals in the area of health and medicine, that it may help us share this knowledge that the spirits bring us, but that we can also come together and work together in new research to reinforce these insights. And we're reminded of how Kardec says in Genesis that Spiritism and science walk hand in hand. And so today we saw these explanations that André Luiz has brought us about the interaction between thought and mind, and how all this process takes place, and that we are not yet fully aware of in this area, scientifically speaking. And as also shared about the published articles by yourself and other colleagues, and how Spiritism has anticipated much of these scientific discoveries. So we thank you very much on behalf of the International Spiritist Medical Association, and we hope that you who are following us can continue to stay tuned as we have more to come. Thank you very much.